In 1866, the Austro-Prussian War broke out in Central Europe, largely due to the diplomatic wrangling of the Prussian Minister-President Otto von Bismarck. His aims in the conflict are the most well known, for they started and ultimately ended it. But lesser known are the designs of the other belligerents, interested neutral parties, and even those of the Prussian government themselves that found it hard to understand the complex political game Bismarck was playing. This video then will look at some of the goals pursued by the other stakeholders in the war. When the war broke out in 1866, the Austrian Empire was the most powerful state in the German Confederation. Since her defeat in Italy 7 years earlier and the loss of Lombardy, Austria had paid more attention to its role as leader of the German-speaking world. Habsburg statesmen began to consider consolidating Austria's role in a more permanent way, specifically by centralising the Confederation's structure and substituting the title of hereditary president for that of German Emperor. The plan was torpedoed by Bismarck in 1863, who had almost resigned to stop Wilhelm I of Prussia agreeing to any such change. But with Austria and Prussia finally at war, the Habsburgs now had the opportunity to destroy the Prussian challenge to their German plans once and for all. Formal Austrian territorial designs revolved almost exclusively around the heavily industrialised province of Silesia, torn from Maria Theresa's realm more than 100 years earlier by Frederick the Great. More importantly, the defeat of Prussia would open the way for the Habsburgs to restructure the German Confederation as they saw fit. Their plans would never have been for the aggressive nation building that occurred under the Prussian-dominated German Empire in reality, but a looser federation in which Franz Joseph exercised more control would certainly have been doable with Prussia prostrate. But whilst the Austrians may have been able to deal with Prussia alone, they also had an enemy to their south. The new Kingdom of Italy still desired the province of Venetia. It was clear that the Austrians would at some point lose the territory. The question for the Habsburgs had always been how to do it honourably. In May, as war seemed more likely, Franz Joseph had finally swallowed his pride and offered the territory to Italy's protector, France, in exchange for Italian neutrality and compensation in Germany. It was too late. Whilst France secretly agreed to allow Austria-Silesia in return for Venetia should they win, the Italians by that time had signed Bismarck's alliance. Thus, when the war began, Europe witnessed the bizarre spectacle of the Austrians sending a large army to fight the Italians over a territory they had already agreed to part with, even if they won. This strategic muddle alone shows why the Habsburgs deserved to lose in 1866. The French Empire of Napoleon III took no direct part in the Austro-Prussian War, but her influence on events cannot be understated. Both Prussia and Austria feared that France may at some point intervene in the war, and consequently tried to buy her support. What the price for that support was, many French policymakers themselves didn't know. Napoleon viewed Italy's acquisition of Venetia as the main aim of his foreign policy. His diplomacy regularly appealed to the national idea, and Italy served as his main protege. He thus sought to extract a commitment to hand Venetia to Italy from both belligerents. Bismarck readily accepted it as a price for an Italian alliance and a commitment to French neutrality. Austria, as discussed before, dithered before finally agreeing to hand it over, whatever the result of the war. French statesmen also saw compensation in Germany itself as a major aim. Napoleon was always lukewarm to the idea, but felt bound to win something for the sake of public opinion. At a meeting with Bismarck in Biarritz, he was able to get some vague agreement for compensation. Napoleon waved towards Luxembourg and Belgium, but it was typical of him to adopt a wait-and-see approach, rather than pressure Bismarck for any solid commitment. He was more concerned with Austria, who he expected to win the war. Along with the commitment to transfer Venetia, he also extracted an agreement that France would be able to set up some sort of buffer state along the River Rhine. This would naturally extend France's influence and provide security. Had the Austrians won the war, this may have actually come to pass. Ultimately, Napoleon's aims were obscured by his typical policy of procrastination, and thus the opportunity to extract anything concrete for France passed him by. The rapid defeat of the Austrians meant Napoleon was in no position to strong-arm either power as he had hoped. The next year, when he tried to refer to Biarritz and purchase Luxembourg, his failure became all the more clear when Prussian threats forced him to back down. France then, despite being in a relatively strong position at the start of the war, had comprehensively failed in its aims, the consequence of which was international isolation and decisive defeat 4 years later. For Italy, the Austro-Prussian War, or Third War of Independence, was centred on claiming Venetia, the province they had expected to take in 1859, but had had the rug pulled from under them by Napoleon when he cut that war short. For this purpose, they agreed a short-term alliance with Bismarck as a war looked more likely. Whilst Austria had eventually agreed to transfer the province to France in 1866, which would then be given to Italy, the Italians preferred to see it transferred legitimately via plebiscite if possible, preferably after they themselves had conquered it. Thus, they went to war. Though the Italians were largely defeated both on land and at sea, it didn't knock them out of the conflict, and with Prussian victories in Bohemia, it was clear they would take hold of Venetia anyway. Italy had hoped to also seize South Tyrol whilst the Austrians were tied up elsewhere, but once Venetia had been assured to them, Bismarck made peace without Italy, meaning she had to accept these limited gains. Franz Joseph delivered one last disdainful slight by handing the province to France rather than Italy, but Napoleon III quickly transferred it. Italy probably had the most limited and clear aims of any of the major parties involved in the war. Even if the Austrians had won, they would still have gained Venetia. In many ways it was a pointless conflict, but it at least provided an opening for the Prussian victory, and thus thwarted any lingering hopes of retaining Venetia in the event of success in Germany that Habsburg statesmen may have held. Whilst Bismarck viewed the war as only part of a greater goal, for many Prussians the conflict was the same as any other, in that whoever won would extract a clearly victorious peace from the vanquished. When Austria was defeated at Königgrätz, the dispute between this view, supported by the King and Chief of General Staff von Moltke, and Bismarck's conception, erupted. The King's view was that Prussia should show its triumph in classic fashion, that is to say, a victory parade through Vienna and the seizure of Austrian territory. What those such as Moltke intended to seize is vague. No one seriously contemplated destroying the Habsburg Empire, though that may have been a side effect of any truly Carthaginian peace. The likely territorial changes were to be additional land from Silesia, along with further annexations of German states that were spared for international considerations by Bismarck, for example the Duchy of Hesse-Darmstadt. These plans were of course made with little consideration for the international ramifications of such annexations. Most importantly, such a peace would undoubtedly have driven Austria into the arms of France. A unified Germany would have been a much more difficult task. Whether Bismarck had genuinely wanted war in 1866 is still debated. He certainly manoeuvred for it, though he may have simply seen the conflict as an alternative if he was unable to force an Austrian climb down diplomatically. The climb down he had been pushing for was the establishment of a Prussian sphere of influence north of the River Main, effectively dividing Germany in two. He had no interest in annexing Habsburg territory, which would ensure permanent Austrian hostility. It is certainly remarkable the way these objectives barely changed, even when the scale of the victory after Königgrätz became clear. They did become slightly more expansive. Austria was now to be totally excluded from German affairs, rather than just the north, while states he would before have preferred to win as allies, such as Hanover, were annexed wholesale. It meant almost all Prussian lands would be territorially connected. Soon after, Bismarck could with little opposition create the North German Confederation and assure Prussia's dominance. Had his aim always been to set the stage for a unified Germany? Again, this is debatable. Germany for Bismarck was only ever to be used as a tool for Prussian aggrandizement. If he had been restricted to just establishing Prussian dominance in the north, he would probably have not felt his work was unfinished. The Austro-Prussian War was, probably more than any other great power conflict since 1815, defined by an incredibly fine margin. The main Austrian commander Benedek had multiple opportunities to defeat the strung-out Prussian army in detail after it had invaded Bohemia. Some slight initiative would have completely turned the tide of the war. As we know, however, Prussian determination triumphed. The work of Frederick was complete, the road to a unified Germany lay open.